So today I'm here to bring you the first part of my August wrap up. Still got a pretty decent amount to talk to you about today, so I'm going to get straight into this with Burmese Days by George Orwell. This was the first book I read this month, and I read this because my boyfriend is an avid George Orwell fan, and I've never really got along with George Orwell. I don't dislike him, but I think for me the main thing I look for in a book is writing, and I think it's a fair thing to say that George Orwell's focus was on politics, so the writing kind of took a back seat. I did enjoy Animal Farm. I read 1984 a very long time ago, so it's unfair to say, but I didn't necessarily enjoy it at the time. I think there were a few holes in it that just, I found myself zoning out a lot, and I don't have fond memories of it as a book. But my boyfriend wanted me to read this, so I thought I'd be fair and give it a go. And I have to say, it's probably the most readable George Orwell that I have come across. I think this was one of his very early, if not his first book. And it came about as a result of him spending some time in Burma, where there was a British occupation, and he didn't like the way that the British were treating the Burmese people, so he left and wrote a book sort of looking at the issues there. This is interesting. It focuses on one of the white men in the town called Florrie, and he is the white man who has the most time for the black people in the town, but he sort of, even though he's like the moral compass of the book, he himself is flawed. He sees the Burmese people as kind of fascinating. He likes to study them, and he sort of humours them almost. You always feel as though he feels like he's, you know, putting upon himself for being so good to them. But compared to the other white people in this novel, Florrie is very pleasant. So white people in the town have this clubhouse, which is where they hang out, and the main sort of focus, I suppose, of the book is that there is a new rule coming in that they have to initiate a black man into the club to sort of be seen as though they are supporting the local community, and things kind of go from there. You very much see the deterioration of any semblance of a relationship between the locals and the white people. That there is a lot of racist language in here, and although I know that that is obviously intentional and it's not George Orwell saying that that's what he believes, but that is how people were treated at the time. But it was quite difficult to read at times, and it almost read the way that a racist novel would read. I have also on the side this month been reading Gone with the Wind, and I think if the racist language in that offends you, this is about 50 times worse. So if you're very sensitive to racial slurs and abuse, then I wouldn't recommend this. Overall though, it was quite a good read. That said, it hasn't overly stuck with me, so I don't know, me and George Orwell are still on the back burner at the moment. Then I finished the final Salt book in my Paddling with Independent Publishers series, and that is Bodies of Water by V.H. Leslie. I have done a full review of this, which I will link down below. If you want to know my in-depth thoughts on this, please check that out. I won't say much about it here other than to say that this is a really short read. It's quite spooky, and it looks at sort of feminist issues in quite an interesting way. It let me down a little bit in the angle that it went for, but overall I would definitely recommend this. I think the writing in here at points shows real potential. I really enjoyed the overall reading experience of this one. Then I finished an audiobook which I have been listening for about a month and a half. I'm going to include it here because I finished it this half of the month, and that is If I Could Tell You Just One Thing by Richard Reed, and it's also narrated by Richard Reed, which I always like. I think it's much better when an author narrates their own book, especially with non-fiction. It's just nice to have that voice behind it. So I'd never heard of this book, but it was on the daily deals on Audible, and it sounded quite nice. It's basically Richard Reed going around meeting iconic famous people. He meets a vast spectrum of people throughout this book, from James Corden to Margaret Atwood and everyone in between. Joanna Lumley's in there, Simon Cowell is in there. There is just a load of people in this book, and basically Richard Reed just went around and asked them what their one main piece of advice would be if somebody went to them for life advice. And obviously there is some really wonderful advice in here because it's from people who have experienced a lot of different things. There are also people who've been imprisoned unfairly and all sorts of things. So every person that he meets, he talks you through the process of his meeting them and why he met them. He gives you a bit of their backstory, and he shows you the discussion that they have, and then leads up to the main piece of advice that they have. So each of the chapters is only about 5 minutes, which made it perfect for audio, because if I had 5 or 10 minutes to spare, I would listen to a few pieces of advice. I would say that I think if you are reading this, I wouldn't recommend reading it as a whole, because I think it would get quite tedious and I think it would probably ruin the experience. If you can, I would recommend getting it on audio because I think it was perfectly suited to that medium. Then I read my non-fiction for the month, which was A Million Little Pieces by James Frey. This is a memoir about James Frey's time in rehab. He got into quite serious alcohol and drug issues at the age of 23 and found himself in one of the best rehab centres. And it basically looks at his 6 weeks in that rehab centre. Now, I want to say, disclaimer, I really enjoyed this book. But on doing a bit of research about James Frey, because I wanted to know what else he had written, I found out that there was quite a lot of controversy about it and that a lot of it was fabricated. I didn't go any further into that, so I don't know the ins and outs of that claim because I didn't want to ruin the book for myself. I've decided that I'm going to review this on face value as a memoir. This follows James Frey from when he gets off a plane. He can't remember why he's on the plane, he can't remember where he's going, and he has got some bad injuries, for example a rip in his cheek and a broken nose and things like that. His parents pick him up from the airport and they pretty much take him straight to rehab. And as with a lot of sort of rehab-esque books, it looks at the people that he's in there with, and they ultimately are what make this story what it is. When people are at their lowest point, they're very good at picking each other back up again, especially if they don't know each other that well. So that was what was really touching for me, was the relationships that James Frey formed in here. And to start with, I didn't like James at all. I kind of felt like his character wasn't developed and that he had this annoying habit of just laughing at everything people said. But as you go on, he really starts to have a journey, as you would expect. And he kind of has a very interesting attitude about rehab. So the centre he is in is very much focused on the methods of AA and the 12-step programme, which obviously focuses very highly on God. And James makes some very intelligent observations about the fact that the problem with AA is that you are simply transferring your addiction onto something else, you're not facing up to it. And he sort of finds his own way through, which at the start the counsellors aren't happy with, but they soon realise that he has his own way of dealing with things and they accept that. There are some really horrendous scenes in here and there are some really horrendous stories. And it's been a long time since I've had a book which I look forward to coming to for the comforting aspect, so it was really pleasant to have that with this. And I also found that I missed the characters when they weren't there, so I would still recommend this one. And then I finished the first half of the month with my short story collection for the month, which was Things to Make and Break by Mei Lan Tan. This was in, I think, the March Moth box. And it's a realist collection, which I was very sceptical about because I don't normally like realist collections. I find them quite difficult to get along with, especially since I've discovered magical realism. I find that magical realist stories just have a lot more weight to them for me. That said, I really enjoyed this collection. There were some stories, especially at the start. I think the first 3 stories kind of let me down. The second one, Date Night, I really didn't enjoy. The other 2 opening stories, I could see their potential, and Mei Lan Tan has a really poetic language style, but they kind of, I felt, were a bit sprawling and a bit losing their point in places. But the other stories in here for the most part were fantastic. There's a story called Laurens, which looks at 2 different Laurens in different situations, both trying to deal with some form of abuse or suffering in their lives. There is a story called DDMMYY, which looks at 2 twin brothers who both fall in love with the same girl, but she then loses her memory of the fact that they were both in love with her and that she was with them both, and it sort of looks at how they deal with that and how that affects their brotherhood. And I think probably my favourite story would be the last one, Would Like to Meet, which looks at a girl who answers a quite strange advert in the newspaper, which kind of suggests that it's going to be a dating thing, but she's not quite sure, and she ends up meeting a couple and it goes from there. I won't say any more because I don't want to spoil it, but it's really sweet and touching and I just thought it was lovely. So overall, there were more strong stories in here than bad ones. I started off being quite annoyed with the stories, and as it went on, I really grew. I don't know whether that was because I adjusted to the style, but I really grew with them and I grew to love this book and I very much enjoyed it. So that is everything I've read so far in August. Pretty impressed. I have definitely done better than I have been doing in previous months. Let me know down below what you've been reading and I'll see you next time. Bye!